I work in a catchment management team, and I think many of you will be familiar with water companies getting involved in catchment management over the last few years. And really what we do is we're just trying to get a better understanding of the catchments that essentially where the water drains into our drinking water sources, be those groundwater or river catchments, understand some of the risks, but also identify opportunities where we can work with land managers, farmers, to actually see if we can solve some of these challenges at source, and hopefully really working with others like FWAG and people like CSF, and work with others to just create a improved farmed environment for a whole range of reasons, but obviously water quality being a key focus for us as a water company. And yeah, I'm just going to give you a quick presentation. Some of you who've been to our sort of physical face-to-face events that we did before COVID will have seen me present on similar topics, but I'll just give you a bit of a background around particularly around nitrates and how cover crops can help sort of mitigate that issue. Next slide, please, Emily. Before I move on, I thought I found this slide, which I thought was a fascinating data set showing sort of long-term cereal yields over the past sort of 1,000 years, really. Amazing data set, and I think it's good to acknowledge, obviously, nitrogen has played a key part. Artificial nitrogen fertilizers in the past 100 years, a key role in improving yields. That's obviously been feeding growing global population. So although obviously excess nitrate and nitrate that's lost to water does have consequences, it's good for me to acknowledge this before we move on. Obviously we all know why we need to use nitrogen, and the role that's played. Next slide, please. But obviously, yeah, one of the downsides of increased nitrogen usage is it can be lost to water in the form of nitrate, and this is another really interesting long-term data set going back to the late 1800s, showing nitrate concentrations in the River Thames. And you can see there was a sort of a big jump really after the post-war period, and up until sort of the 1980s, where nitrate concentrations did increase. And you can see from the 1980s onwards, actually, we're now seeing a decreasing trend, because obviously with much better regulation and rules around nutrient management, improved precision farming, things are clearly getting better, but still there is still elevated concentrations of nitrate in our waterways. So yeah, okay, next slide, please. And this is another slide that's perhaps quite pertinent for us as a water company, because a lot of our water sources are from chalk aquifers, and actually the chalk holds on to nitrate for a very long time. So this just shows nitrate that's stored in different types of chalk aquifer over the past 100 years, and you can see particularly in chalk, which is the predominant aquifer that we abstract from, we can see that there's been a big increase in nitrates stored in those aquifers over the last 100 years, and that will take many decades to decline naturally. So we haven't got a huge amount of wiggle room in terms of managing nitrate in some of these aquifers. Next slide, please. And obviously the consequences of nitrate loss to water is it can contribute towards eutrophication, along with phosphorus as well, is another key nutrient that contributes to eutrophication. This is essentially increasing the nutrient content in waters, and obviously that's damaging for the ecology of lakes and rivers, but also increased nitrate in water puts pressure on drinking water supplies, because we have a drinking water standard for nitrate that's 50 milligrams per litre. So when sources get close to that or above that standard, we have to manage that, and that can be by treatment or blending, or worst case scenario, we actually will lose that source. So there's a great incentive for us to try and actually manage this, obviously not only by using treatment, but also see what we can do by working in the catchment to try and mitigate this problem at source. Next slide, please. And that's where cover crops really come in. You know, cover crops are a really great way of reducing some of the nitrate leaching. Obviously, there are other sources. I'm not saying this is the only source of nitrate leaching, but we see it as a good opportunity to you know, to work with farmers to see if we can try and increase the uptake of cover crops in catchments. And this diagram just kind of conceptualizes the issue really. It's nitrate leaches in the winter months, when obviously when we have heavier rainfall and the soils are saturated. It doesn't really leach when nitrogen is being applied. Obviously that's when it's being used up bit by the crop. But if you have any residual nitrate left in the soil over the winter months, and if that soil is left bare, doesn't have a growing crop, then there's a pretty high chance that nitrate is going to leach. So if you just click on the next button, Emily, there's just a little animation here. If we could put a cover crop over those winter months, we've got a much better chance of holding on to that residual nitrate and reducing leaching, and hopefully, obviously, that nitrate becomes available for the next spring crop. Okay, next slide, please. And if you click again, Emily. Thanks. But obviously, you know, nitrate capture is only one element of why cover crops kind of are beneficial. Obviously, from a farmer's perspective, you'll certainly be interested in holding on to that nitrate that you've paid for, but also, you know, you'll be interested in the benefits cover crops provide for building soil carbon, you know, benefits of integrated pest management. And there's also, you know, other benefits for water as well. Cover crops can reduce soil loss. You know, if you've got a bare field next to a water course on a slope, if that's covered with a cover crop over winter, that's just going to stabilize the soil much more. And we're interested, you know, could cover crops grown in the right mix in the right place, could that increase infiltration? And this could be key for, you know, areas of where we have groundwaters. And also, you know, there's a range of other benefits that I know are quite well understood, you know, how they aid biodiversity and other things. So although nitrate is the, you know, the thing that got us interested in cover crops in the first place, we kind of acknowledge that they actually do a lot of other good as well. Okay, next slide, please. And this is something that some of you will be familiar with, some of you will be part of our Entrade cover crop scheme, and this is something we've been running for the last couple of years now. And the map on the right just shows the target area, which is in North Hertfordshire and South Cambridgeshire. And this is essentially a way of us funding sort of greater uptake of cover crops. So we put a pot of money into the auction, and then farmers can place bids for to grow different types of cover crops for different lengths of time, and they will be paid accordingly depending on how much it is calculated that cover crop will capture nitrate. Obviously, some species are better than others at holding on to nitrate, so it's kind of optimizing the cover crops towards nutrient retention, but we want to allow the farmer to obviously also utilize the other benefits that cover crops can provide. So we do stipulate that the mix can contain 25% of any other species of their choice, just to allow some of that diversity, which I think is really important. I think we're beginning to understand how important that diversity is in terms of cover crops delivering, you know, multiple benefits. And you know, for those of you who sit in this area, we are running this again next year. We're just bringing things to a close for this year. Payments are being sorted at the moment for this year, and we are going to run the auction again next year. We are looking to expand the area again, and it's likely that we're going to expand the other side of Hitchin. So in between Hitchin and Luton is another area where we have a number of groundwater sources. So we'd like to extend it out into that area. So we will be in touch in the coming months for all, you know, all eligible farmers in those areas. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, and this is, I just wanted to show a few photos. These, I went out the end of last year and visited a number of the cover crops, and you know, I was really impressed with many of the fields that I visited. There was really good diversity of you know, species, and yeah, I think it was particularly good growing conditions last year for cover crops for some farmers. So yeah, some of them were looking really great, and that was really nice to see. Okay, next slide, please. I'm just going to finish off with some water quality data. I guess we've all got quite used to seeing line graphs over the past year for a different reason, but yeah, I'll just highlight, give you a flavour for water quality locally for those of you who farm locally. So this just shows nitrate concentrations in one of our groundwater sources in North Hertfordshire, and this goes back to the 60s, and this just sort of highlights in a local context how those nitrate concentrations have increased over the past sort of, you know, past 60-70 years. There's a bit of a gap in that data there, but essentially that the trend is upwards. If you click next slide, please, Emily. But if we zoom in, this is actually now looking at the last 20 years. It's the same source, it's the same data set, but the time is just over the last 20 years, and we can see actually we have seen those nitrate concentrations stabilize, so they're not continuing to go up, and that, you know, that mirrors the you know, improved nutrient management on farms. So that's great to see. But the red line is the drinking water standard. So so we still see that the purple line is nitrate, and that's, you know, periodically we see that go above the drinking water standard. So that's where we have to turn the treatment on. But also the blue line is groundwater levels, and this is also another big influence on nitrate concentration. So when we get those groundwater levels going up very high, which is what we're seeing this winter for obvious reasons, because it hasn't stopped raining, that causes that basically the groundwater comes into contact with more recently leached nitrate, and that causes a sort of seasonal spike. So it's these seasonal spikes that we think we can sort of mitigate by increasing uptake of cover crops, and hopefully, you know, keep those below the red line, you know, for as long as possible. Next slide, please. And just finally, just two more slides for those of you who are familiar with these catchments. You may be interested. So this is the River Bean. This is a chalk stream in Hertfordshire. We've been monitoring. We haven't been monitoring nitrate in the catchment for as long, but there are longer data sets that exist. But we've been monitoring nitrate quite intensively since 2017 here, and actually the River Bean is not concentrations are quite low compared to other similar chalk streams in the area, but you do see again a little bit of seasonality. Come the winter months, you see those concentrations go up, and they generally go down again over the summer. And if you click again, next slide please, Emily. And this is the River Rib, which is a neighbouring chalk stream. You can see a much more clearer seasonality for the River Rib, and you actually see concentrations go quite a bit higher. So the River Rib seems to you know, be showing higher nitrate concentrations. There could be a whole range of reasons for that, but you can clearly see some quite large spikes in those winter months. And again, this year we've seen a similar picture to the last 4 winters. Next slide, please. So that's it for me, really. Just to summarise key points. Obviously, we have a drinking water standard for nitrate, which is 50 milligrams per litre. Nitrate is an expensive and technically difficult thing to remove from water. So, you know, it's within our interest to try and reduce this at source. And cover crops are an excellent way of capturing residual nitrate and reducing leaching. But we're also, you know, completely acknowledged and excited by the many other services and goods that these cover crops can deliver for the farmer and the environment. And that's all from me, so thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Shaun. That was very informative. If you have any questions for Shaun, don't forget to put them in the chat along the bottom of your screen, and we will look at those after we've heard from Emily. So Emily Stacey is the project manager for FWAG East, and she's in charge of the cover crop trial. So that means not just that she's just not in charge of them, but she carries them all out. So all the sampling and the monitoring, whatever the weather. So she's going to tell us about this year's trials and the results that we've had. Now, I believe we've also got Kenneth Grant from the Coconac estate where the trials took place on the call. So I'm hoping he might be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So again, please keep questions coming into the chat for Shaun, Emily, and possibly Kenneth. Thanks. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Right, so yeah, as Elizabeth said, I'm going to talk about the cover crop trial. I'll introduce you to the site this year and show you some of the sampling that we've been doing and some of the results. Sorry, been a bit slow. Yeah, so Shaun's really covered this, really, the background to the project. Large amount of their sources that they use for drinking water comes from groundwater sources, which are at times exceeding or at risk of exceeding the nitrate drinking water standard. And again, as Shaun said, the ability of it's recognised the ability of cover crops to capture nitrates. And so we want to encourage farmers within the catchment to do so. So this is the aim of the project, to demonstrate the value in terms of nitrate leaching and biodiversity, and then, as I said, encourage farmers to take up cover cropping. So the site, this is Coconac, this is the field. It's at Coconac Estate in Barkway in North Hertfordshire. The field was a clay soil with impeded drainage. Farming system was really a min-till system, and they've been experimenting with cover crops over the last couple of years. There was a total of 7 plots established, and these included 2 different cover crop mixtures and 3 different establishment dates. So one of each cover crop plot mixture was established on the 3 different establishment dates, and we also asked Kenneth to maintain a stubble control plot. So we did a wide range of sampling. As we were wanting to look at the nitrate that's been lost through the soil, we installed porous pots. So that allowed us to collect water samples which could then be analysed for their nitrate content. We also did soil sampling. So we did a baseline sampling in August, September. So each plot was sampled just after its establishment date. And then we also did an end of season sampling in January. And soil samples were taken at 3 different depths, so 15, 30 and 60 centimetres. And these were then analysed for the standard soil tests, so phosphorus, potassium, magnesium and pH, but also organic matter and soil mineral nitrogen. Worm counts were also undertaken at the baseline and end of season sampling dates. Plant tissue samples were taken at the end of the season in January so that they could be analysed for nitrate and carbon content. Infiltration rates were also monitored throughout the season. So we did this in September, mid-November and January. And as you can see in the photo in the top right-hand corner, there's a white pipe that's been hammered into the ground. And what we do is measure how long it takes for 200 millilitres of water to infiltrate into that core. And that's repeated twice within that soil core. And the second recording is is thought to be the most reliable. And we were doing this in 3 different locations for each of the cover crops. As I said, we were also looking at biodiversity benefits. So we undertook flower head counts to get an idea of the pollen nectar sources that are available. And we were also doing arthropod counts through sweep netting and pitfall trapping. So here are the cover crop plots. So we've got one more simple mixture that was 3 different species, so barracuda radish, phacelia and oat. And then we then had a more diverse mixture of linseed phacelia, barracuda radish, buckwheat, god of pleasure and turnip rape. These mixtures were designed with the help of King's, and King's supplied the seed. So plot 1 and 3, these were established at the start of August, and these were broadcast into a standing wheat crop using an Avadex applicator with a fixed 12-metre boom. And then it was originally planned that the next 2 plots, plot 4 and 5, would be established in mid-August, just after harvest. As you can see, this was delayed till the 9th of September. This was due to there being straw in the field that wasn't dry enough to be removed. And as a result, plot 6 and 7 were also delayed from early September, and they were drilled on the 17th. As you can see on the 2 different drilling dates, there was a different drill used. There wasn't a reason for that. It was just, I think, what Kenneth had to hand in the yard at the time. So this, I just thought I'd show you how different cover crop mixtures and how good they are at capturing nitrate. So as you can see, the brassicas, so the oil radish, the mustard and the turnip rape are very good at capturing nitrates, oil radish particularly, and that's why it was used within the 2 cover crop mixtures that we had in the at the trial site this year. And this is just a photo of the seed being broadcast into plot 1. The ground conditions were very dry, it was very hot, soil was cracked, but luckily in the sort of 2 to 3 weeks following, we did have some rain which allowed the crops to start to grow. And here are photos taken in December, and this just shows the difference in establishment of the 7 different plots. So as you can see, plot 1 and plot 3, the mixtures which were broadcast on the earliest date did achieve a better cover and a greater sort of above ground biomass. You can just about see that the seed didn't really establish in the tram lines, probably due to some compaction. So plot 4 to plot 7, which were the mixtures that were drilled, didn't quite see such successful growth. There's a fair bit of bare ground and the individual plants are quite small. This is possibly due to the delayed drilling, but also the wet ground conditions. It was extremely wet from sort of October onwards, and there was puddling on the surface. Generally, if you're looking at them, plots 6 and 7 did establish slightly better than the 2 plots that were drilled on the middle date. This is possibly due to different ground conditions. So plot 4 and 5 were a bit wetter than plot 6 and 7, but also the impact of possibly the different drill use causing a different soil conditions. As you can see in the stubble, there's fairly limited natural regeneration occurring. There was some volunteer wheat, thistles and some other arable weeds, but not a huge amount, and that was similar throughout all of the plots. In terms of species included, the oil radish and buckwheat were the first to establish within each of the mixtures. You can see by December the radish has started to yellow a bit, but it was still providing a good cover. The buckwheat had disappeared by the end of November. It's not a frost-tolerant plant, but it wasn't the frost. It was, I think, deer damage. It just nibbled off all of the leaves and then it just disappeared. And this is just a photo, hopefully illustrating just how wet the site was. And this is likely to have stunted the growth, particularly in those later drill plots. So in terms of porous pot sampling, we had 28 porous pots installed in September at the site, and these were installed in groups of 4 under each of the plots. And the pots are buried at 90 centimetres deep. The reason for this is viewed as being out of the rooting zone, So any water and nitrate being carried is going to be lost to the groundwater rather than intercepted by roots. Water sampling started in October, and we were doing it every fortnight. We ended it in the start of January. Each sample collected was tested for nitrate. The majority of the 28 plots did provide samples on every visit. Samples that came from plot 1, which was the earlier established simple mix, they were a lot smaller than some of the other water samples and had to be merged for nitrate analysis. So for those of you that haven't seen a porous pot before, this is what they look like. So the bottom portion, the white part, is the porous part, and then you've got 2 tubes coming out of the top, one red and one white. And the right picture shows when they're installed. So these 2 tubes they protrude from the ground, and they have 2 clips on them. So when we come to apply a vacuum, we leave the white tube clipped, unclip the red tube, and we draw air out of the red tube. We then clip the red tube before removing the syringe, and this is left overnight. We come back the next day, and both tubes are then unclipped. We then push air into the red tube, which forces the water out of the white tube, and there's your sample. So here is the results from this autumn. You can generally see nitrate concentrations were pretty high throughout the season. Looking at the individual plots, plot 1, which did see the best establishment and it was the mixture with the higher percentage radish, did seem to perform better in terms of reducing nitrate leaching. You can also see there in the last sort of 4 or 5 visits in plot 1, there was a gradual decrease in the nitrate concentration seen, possibly as the crop's establishing and it's performing better. Generally, plot 7 seemed to be the one that was producing the high nitrate concentrations on each sampling visit. What we normally expect and have seen in previous years is that the stubble plot would be the one producing the highest nitrate concentrations, generally because there's less vegetation growth going on there than the other cover crop plots, but this wasn't seen this year. So I thought it was worth showing last year's results, the previous year. This was also at Coconach, but in a different field. And in this year, we had 4 different mixtures, a stubble control and a bare plot. And you can see here the stubble control is producing the highest nitrate concentrations. In terms of the plot producing the lowest, it was actually the more diverse mixture, possibly due to the more diverse rooting system going on there, more nitrate being picked up from different depths. And then the previous year to that, autumn 2018, it's really clear in this year that the stubble is producing much higher nitrate concentrations than water samples being collected from any of the other cover crops. This was a year we did see particularly good growth of the cover crops, and as you can see, the nitrate concentration is pretty low. They actually got so tall the mustard was up to my shoulder, and I think the farmer, this is at Manor Farm Barley, was slightly concerned about how he was going to destroy them. But just using this as a comparison, you see here the highest nitrate concentration in this year was around 20 milligrams a litre. And if you compare that to the concentrations we were seeing this autumn, the lowest we saw was 20 and the highest was 150. So it's quite a significant difference. And I'll just finish off by showing you some of the results from the Arthropod sampling. So these are not particularly great because they were taken on my phone, but these are photos of the sorts of things we were finding in the pitfall trapping that we were undertaking. So springtails, tree bugs, and ground beetles were the most commonly found types. Then as you can see, we also saw a lot of other beetles, some ground beetle larvae, harvestman spiders, and there was the odd slug that managed to find their way in there. In terms of the plots, the highest number of arthropod counts from the pitfall trapping actually was seen within the plots that had more bare ground, so the stubble and then the 4 drilled plots. This is the opposite of what we saw with sweep netting. So with sweep netting, we were seeing much higher numbers collected in the plot 1 and plot 3, which were the 2 that were established earliest and had got better biomass and above ground vegetation. And here we were seeing more smaller beetles and flies being caught. In terms of plot 1, in the final sweep netting in November, the net was pretty much full of flea beetle. It had been the plot that had seen most damage from flea beetle. The others had seen some, but not quite to the extent. So general conclusions, we'd say that the plot with the best establishment showed the best reduction in nitrate leaching. The plots with greater vegetation growth encouraged more of the airborne invertebrates, and the plots with more bare ground tended to have higher numbers of ground-dwelling invertebrates. We didn't quite see what we'd seen in normal years with the stubble producing the highest nitrates, but we did see that a plot that had a better green cover was reducing the amount of nitrate that was being leached through the soil. Thank you.
Oops. Thanks very much, Emily. There was lots of information in there. The event is being recorded, so if you need to look back at it, we will make that available to you. But that was full of interesting facts. We do have a few questions. So if Rebecca, are you there, or you want to present some of the questions for us?
Yes, can do, Elizabeth. Yeah, so we've got one question about the clay type that we've got and quite rightly, you know, the clay soils are very varied. It's chalky boulder clay around the sort of coconuts on that particular sort of field area. So I know that's sort of quite a common soil type in this neck of the woods. Nicholas Buxton, one for you, Shaun. Why are there no incentive from Affinity Water for cover crops around the River Ash, which is also a lovely river? So, Shaun,
yeah, it's a good point. And you know, ideally, it would be great to be able to fund cover crops everywhere in our patch. But as it stands, the kind of targeted area that's chosen is driven by particular groundwater sources that are particularly vulnerable, and it's those sources where we're essentially regulated, and we're allowed to spend the money focusing around those areas. So we have to focus the money around those sources. We've expanded, we've pushed it a bit and expanded it further because we see benefits of cover crops, you know, having much wider benefits than just for these particular sources. And potentially in time, you know, it's something that where I suppose as we build up more evidence, as we trial this approach more and more, there could be a justification to kind of divert more funds towards this. But there always has to be that element of you know, benefit to those particular sources that are vulnerable. And I mean, I'd have to check which sources we have along the River Ash. But you know, watch this space ultimately. You know, not ruling anything out.
Yeah, thanks, Shaun. And also just a reminder that cover crops is an option, you know, eligible within countryside stewardship. I know, Nicholas, you're already in it, but for those who are sort of thinking about it, you know, it's worth looking at cover crops as an option in stewardship as well. One other question, Emily, for you from Will. When were the photos taken that you showed?
Yeah, sorry, they were in December.
Yeah.
And I did go and visit them again this week, and they were completely dead, apart from Phacelia. The Phacelia is starting to take over, but I think the snow and the wet conditions really got to them.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say they didn't establish as well this year, did they?
No.
Where they've been sort of waist height.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all the questions for the moment. So over to you, Elizabeth.
We will have a chance for more questions later. Do keep them coming in the chat, and remember that we've also got Paul from Kings and Kenneth from Coconach. But now I'm very pleased to introduce George Young. who's going to talk to us about the whole farm approach. So some of you may have come across George. He farms south of Basildon in Essex, and he's been making a name for himself as an enthusiastic and forward-looking farmer and communicator. But I'll let him tell you about his farm and how he has transformed it over the last few years.
Lovely, thanks very much for that. Hopefully my screen is sharing. If you let me know if it isn't, that'd be good. But that should.
Yes, they've got that.
There we go, lovely. I'll just get rid of that. Perfect. Cool. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming, of course, for a start. Thanks very much for FWAG for inviting me along today. I'm sure an awful lot of you know who I am. For those who don't, my name's George Young, otherwise known as Farming George. You can find me on that handle on Instagram and Twitter and YouTube and all the other social medias, and I try and do quite a lot on there. So for a start, as a little bit of background, I'm not really a conventional farmer. I actually worked in Barclays Bank for a number of years after university. That was in physical oil trading, and I was in London then, mostly because I wanted to be a musician and wanted to make movies. So I actually returned home when I was 27, about 8 years ago. And actually before that, so when I was a teenager, I hadn't really done too much in the way of farming. I actually had 2 days of farming, or probably about half a day each. The first one I went rolling, and I remember Dad telling me that when I was comfortable in that gear, I could move up to the next one. He didn't tell me to then not move up any more gears. So I got the field done before lunch, and my sister then had to go and do it again because I'd done it too quickly. And the second, also very auspicious farming that I'd done before was rowing up some linseed straw with the Sanderson. I think I was 20, 21 at the time, and rode it up too close to the hedge and set the hedge on fire as well. So obviously I was always going to be made out to be a good farmer. But we have got farming on both sides of the family going back a long way, so I have quite a lot of heritage in it. But yes, this was me actually 8 years ago. Like I say, not a typical farmer. I've put on a little bit of weight since then, as I'm sure you can tell. But you know, farming hasn't stopped me wanting to, or being happy to still make a little bit of a wally of myself. First Dates Hotel Series 3, Episode 3, if anyone wants to see me being a wally on television. Now, as I'm sure a lot of you know, I'm pretty outspoken. This was a little article, a kind of condensed version of a longer article I wrote on my blog about GM and GE on the back of Boris getting into power and saying they were going to push science in farming and all these kind of things. I'm really worried about gene editing. I'm actually even doing a talk on Sunday about that. And I do not think it is the way forward in farming. But anyway, that's probably a topic for discussion another time. A little bit of background to the farm. So we've been here since 1954. Now, originally, sort of when I came home, we were around about 490 hectares of arable. Then we got some rough grazing as well on some marshland, 60 hectares-ish of that. But last year we went into stewardship pretty hard. So 200 hectares into legume fallows. We've now got 80 hectares in herbal lays on top of that. And the reasoning for this is my farm is really worn out. And I think if people are honest with themselves, their farms are worn out as well. And, you know, historically, we also did a lot of veg for the London markets. But then we were encouraged to specialize like everyone was. You know, 1970s, joining the EU, leading, you know, people to go down their kind of individualist routes of farming. So we went down the combinable cropping route. But Dad did always keep a small herd of cattle, store cattle. So one's bought out of the market, you know, usually steers, so castrated males, but they were kept out on our rough grazing. They weren't actually part of our arable system. So this was me when I first came back to the farm, attempting to plough. Never really did get on very well with that. This was me. I got a flat tire here for some reason. I seem pretty good at getting flat tires as well. Anyway, yeah, so I have done ploughing in my life. Just this field, Dad still chastises me for the fact we've got a couple of wallows around the edge where I didn't manage to do my headlands very well, and we get water. So anyway, never mind. So yeah, so I came back to the farm in 2013, May 2013, which feels both very, very recently and also a very long time away because my life has changed a lot in that time. And I'm sure an awful lot of you guys know or have come across Kevin Piercy, who's my agronomist, an agronomist for ProCam. One of the first things he did since I came home to the farm, when I came home, we were kind of mostly min-till with a bit of ploughing. He introduced me to Simon, went down to the Dengie to go and see what Simon was up to. Obviously, Simon farming with a Simtech drill, having been no-till for several years before that. And that kind of really got me thinking about wanting to go zero-till. I mean, basically, I came back, said to Dad, I think we should go zero-till, and we started in 2014. So, but really what happened was that was me beginning to think differently about how agriculture could work. At the start, I was just thinking about how I could make my current system better. So how a 100% arable system could be better. And I wasn't really thinking any differently. So it did get me thinking about cover crops and obviously about not doing any tillage. But things have progressed quite a lot since then. And now we're kind of looking, actually, we've just begun our first 20 hectares of organic conversion. So yeah, lots of things are changing more and more. This is what some of our wheat looks like this year. This was late-ish established, but I've got some pictures that I don't really want to show because they look quite appalling. It's getting really tricky in these weather conditions to get decent crops established, to be perfectly frank. I'm sure you're all finding exactly the same. And of course, we're having consistently wet winters and consistently dry summers. I mean, I'm looking now forward on the weather forecast without any rain in the forecast, and I think, are we there now? Are we already starting the summer drought? So really, we do need to think about how we're going to make our systems resilient for these really weird weather patterns. For a little bit of background, we're around about 600 mil, 590, 600 mil average rainfall on this farm. Just comes in lumps and bumps. So anyway, I'd been back 2013, fast forward 4 years, and at this point in time, I really felt like I was in a rut. We'd been zero-till for a while, but we were still 100% arable, and essentially something just didn't feel like it was, I was missing something. I kept on going to meetings and I didn't feel like I was learning anything, which drove me really nuts because I love learning about new stuff. And I was just producing these kind of few commodity crops. I didn't really understand where they were going. I knew I was growing milling wheat, or trying to. I didn't always hit the spec. I knew I was growing peas, and they sometimes went to human consumption, but I didn't know really what type, and they sometimes went to animal feed, and I didn't know which animals they even went to. But I went that June, I remember it being a scorching hot day, and I went to an organic farmers and growers event. OF&G are actually who are the people certifying my organic conversion now. And they do an event every year, and I would recommend everyone go to this event, NOCC, which I think is National Organic Combinable Crops. And I went to their event that summer, an annual event. John Pawsey did an online hosting of it last year and is doing a proper hosting of it this year. And I heard there about Wakelin's YQ population wheat. Wakelin's is an amazing kind of research farm up in Suffolk. And my very good friend Henrietta is actually starting a bakery up there at the moment. And it was started by someone called Martin Wolf, or Professor Martin Wolf, who sadly died just over a year ago. And he was incredible. He's one of the pioneers of agroforestry within the UK. He planted all his trees, or a lot of his trees, in the early 90s. So it's quite a magnificent place to go and visit. It really feels like something quite magical when you go and see there. But one of the other things he also did in his retirement. So yeah, this Wakelin's was a retirement project for Martin, not something when he was actually a plant researcher before that. But he developed the YQ population wheat. And this population has 20 varieties that were kind of crossed every which way, chosen for yield. So certain varieties chosen for yield and certain varieties chosen for quality, so for protein content. And it formed 198 different crosses, and that population was then grown on and grown on. And the results obviously harvested and resown, always without any seed treatment on them, and always just resown on the same farm. So you get a really kind of interesting mix by doing it that way. This was actually the first year I grew YQ. I've been more interested in other stuff to take pictures every single year of YQ, but it's a really nice, diverse mix of things. It's really interesting to see how different ears form and really see the diversity in these crops. It's quite cool versus kind of a really conventional crop of, say, Crusoe or Malika or anything like that. But it makes you think, so why is this YQ so special? What is it that kind of makes it important in a farming system? Now, one thing just to point out here, all of the wheats that are, or that were parents of these crosses within the YQ are all from modern wheat breeding lines. So when we talk about modern wheat breeding, we tend to be talking sort of 1930s, 1940s onwards. So all of the Marises, they're all going to be considered more, modern wheats, even though they're from the kind of 1960s. But the attributes of YQ, so it grows really tall. It's fantastic at nutrient scavenging. It's got lots of resilience. But I think these two last points are almost some of the most important here. It tastes amazing, and it's absolutely fantastic to bake with. And this is not me as a very amateurish baker saying that it's fantastic to bake with. This is really good friends of mine, really superb bakers who absolutely love working with YQ wheat. It really starts helping you when you think about these different attributes. It helps you start to look at your farm in a different way and start to choose what you want to grow. So for a point, I don't actually grow YQ with any nitrogen, and I don't grow it with any pesticides either. So I need plants that are going to grow well in that kind of zero synthetic input environment. Now, not everything goes plain sailing. If you've got a tall wheat, this sometimes happens. This was actually a patch. I think Dad always used to have muck from the egg farm dumped here for spreading. And so obviously a very nitrogen rich area. So the wheat went down, but thankfully it actually went down early enough and then grew back up. It was kind of about 5 foot tall when it went down. So it was on the tall side. This next crop was on harvest day, and you can actually see within here, you can see the different types of ears that we've got. So you've got some little ones, some big ones, some hairy ones. Really exciting to see that variety. But in terms of how that then affects the way I actually do farming on the back of it. So these pictures were taken, this would have been 16 months ago, I guess, something like that. So if you look here, the picture on the left is the field of wheat post YQ. So having not had any synthetic inputs on it whatsoever. And then literally I was 4 or 5 paces to the right where the picture on the right is taken. That's the difference between these two areas. That was a conventional wheat crop grown with your full pre-em chemistry, your Atlantis Pacificas, whatever it was we stuck on that year, and with 180 kilos of nitrogen. Now, next slide is jumping down. You can see kind of from the bottom end of the field, so switching down. So where the dog is where the YQ was, and then on the left-hand side was the conventional wheat. And the picture on the left is kind of the opposite way around from the other end of the field. And the interesting thing is, you think, well, I've applied all the inputs. How come I've got tons of grass there? And a lot of this is driven on nitrogen, as I'm sure you know. These grass weeds absolutely love nitrogen. But it really makes you think, well, how broken is our system that I can grow a really tall variety that naturally is able to block out weeds and doesn't bring more weeds into the system? Or I can grow these modern varieties that have all these other inherent problems that drive us down this system where we have to use an awful lot of synthetic inputs to make sure that we can keep them clean. And quite frankly, the side with the YQ, I'd probably grow an arable crop in a field that looked like that again. The other side I wouldn't. And thankfully, this field is now in a herbal lay and looks like a hell of a lot better for it. So really, this is kind of begins now to really start informing how I'm trying to change my system. And essentially, I want to build something that's super resilient, but with nature as kind of the key growing point and food as the output. Now, I know that we all think as farmers that we're growing food. Certainly when I first came home, I thought that I was growing food, and to some extent you are. But I think it's more that trying to shorten that supply chain and really understand where your food is going. That's when it gets exciting. So kind of for a few years now, I've been farming with less and less artificial inputs. I'm actually driving that down to 0, obviously, with my organic conversion. We've been categorically no insecticides for quite a number of years now. I think 2015 on the whole, but I did do a little trial in 2016 with some that really proved to me that I should not be using insecticides. And what I think is really important within farming is when you're just growing 3 crops, you don't have much flexibility. And without that flexibility, you can't kind of shift and change. And with Brexit happening, with COVID having happened, we need to be able to pivot and change what we're doing much quicker within farming. And the kind of system that we've been running for the last 20, 30, 40 years doesn't allow that. And then most important of all, really, is having some level of resilience to weather, because it's pretty tricky at the moment. So just going back a few steps, I'm going to define agroecology here. I actually did a 2-minute video on this a number of months ago now, because I felt that agroecology was being threatened by the regen ag kind of being watered down in terms of a definition. And there are kind of 3 really key points here as to what agroecology is. First of all is farming with nature. That's the kind of farming aspect. And with that, what I'm meaning is, growing without the synthetic inputs or with significantly reduced synthetic inputs. Plant diversity, so that's growing loads and loads of different things, lots of different types of crops, lots of different types of grasses, really mixing things up. And obviously provision of nature habitat. You have to have lots of places where nature can call home, where you're not disturbing it, and these kind of interconnected pathways for nature to get about everywhere and ensure that you've got all the beneficial insects in all the right places to help when you do get pests coming in. The second key point is then circular farming. And this is the idea about making sure that you, any waste products that you have on the farm, you keep on the farm, you retain, and you actually convert into a secondary product. So the idea with this is some really simple ones. If I'm going to be cleaning grain on my farm, then when I clean it, I've obviously got the waste grain, so the 20% that you clean out, because when you clean out, you always lose some good stuff. Well, that makes you think, well, surely I'm going to want some chickens who can eat that, or some pigs maybe. So just a way of utilizing those other waste products. And then the third point, and this is a really critical one that actually regen ag doesn't cover off at all, and this is food sovereignty. This is the idea that kind of every single person has the chance to really understand where their food comes from, see how it's grown, maybe get a chance to kind of participate in how it's grown. All of those things are really, really critical to people actually valuing the food that they're eating. This isn't affordability, but actual value, that they value it and they're going to pay more for that food because it's actually worthwhile to them from a health perspective, because they know the people who are growing it. Really, really important. So over the last 70 years, obviously we've had massive industrialization. Siloed agriculture, this is where you have people who are just milk farmers, just beef farmers, just arable farmers, just hawk farmers, people who don't do all the kind of mixed farming that was our heritage 100 odd years ago. Obviously we've got fields rolled together, hedgerows ripped out, complete desertification with these massive great fields where you don't end up with wildlife getting to the middle of them. And obviously a huge amount of loss of natural capital. We don't have any wildflower meadows really, we've lost a lot of woodland. And quite frankly, I mean, this is obviously the antithesis of what I just defined as agroecology, but the food on the back of this system quite often isn't healthy. I'm not actually stating that the crops that we're all growing aren't necessarily healthy, but the way that they're processed actually is not particularly healthy. They're processed very quickly. It means that the nutrition in those crops isn't necessarily bioavailable to humans that eat them. And it's actually driving kind of the massive health crisis we've got and the expense of the NHS at the moment. So I think actually some of the people on this call would have been at this meeting. It was at Hugh Willett's on their monitor farm last year. And there was a fantastic entomologist talking, and it really got me thinking about a few different things. They were saying that entomologists, well, it's obviously a fantastic word, but they're people who research insects. And we know we need lots of beneficial insects, because if you're going to grow without insecticides, you need those beneficial insects to come in and take care of any nasties that you have going on. And this guy said that insects tend to travel out sort of 70 to 80 meters from the margins of the field. So based on that, you think, okay, so maybe the maximum width for my field should be sort of 150 meters. But also in this same discussion, he said there was kind of a drop off. So lots and lots and lots would come out 20 meters, and then there'd be this big drop off to sort of 70 to 80 meters. And I thought, well, hang on, well, in which case I want all of them to come out. So I want my, I want 20 meters to be my benchmark for field width. So I kind of thought, right, so in which case the maximum field width for me to get, to reduce the desertification in the middle of my field as much as possible is to say my fields can't be any wider than 40 meters. Now you've got lots of choices for this, because obviously we need to be able to farm with kind of efficient machinery that we've learned to do recently. So 36-meter boom sprayers and combines and seed drills. We don't want to be going down to little tiny fields that are awkward to manage. So we could obviously use beetle banks, but why would you want to just write off some land which could still be harvestable, can still make you money? And I've talked about resilience a lot. Maybe it could be a different type of harvestable income. as well as that, I want to maybe harvest outside of August. That would be nice and beneficial. And I want to be 3D cropping the field, having all the benefits of not just ground level crops, but some taller ones as well. So I think you all know what I'm talking about. It's obviously time for trees in my system area. This is my first field of agroforestry. So this is a 20-hectare field that we've put over to agroforestry at the moment. So agroforestry, for people who don't know, essentially it's using lines of trees or shrubs, and you've got belts of trees and then alleys in between where you grow crops. And ordinarily you'll grow north to south, which gives you best light interception. Also, we've got prevailing winds kind of from the southwest. So the north-south tree planting will then arrest that prevailing wind and prevent disease transfer across crops. So those are sorts of the basic sort of ideas. And there are actually some great examples of established agroforestry. I've already mentioned Wakelands, which is one that you should all go and visit because it's quite frankly magical. But there's also Stephen Briggs. So this is Briggs's farm here, Whitehall Farm in just south of Peterborough. For some reason, I didn't get close enough to get a really clear picture of the trees, but you can kind of see what's happening. So he's on a 27 meter between trees system, so he can run a 24 meter sprayer down. He's actually organic, so he doesn't obviously put synthetics on, but he's designed that system so it is possible to do that. There's then Mike Mallett's system. He's in Kelsale in East Suffolk. He does grow crops, but he's also kind of quite a mixed farmer. So he's got a lot of pastured chickens. So these are for egg laying. Genuinely, if you've had pastured eggs, they are fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And he's got a really beautiful farm up there. And there are lots of options within agroforestry. You can do ones which are just for coppice. They can be long-term or short-term coppice. So hazel and willow are quite short-term, but you can also be coppicing, woodland that's on a 20 or 30-year coppice rotation. And some of that could be for furniture making, some could be for mulch. So willow mulch is fantastic for the salicylic acid content, same as what you got in aspirin. And they make other trees really healthy if you put that mulch around them. Obviously fruit and nut, that's pretty obvious. But then there's some fun ones. So you can get sugar from sap. So maple syrup, you can't do in the UK. We don't get cold enough for maple sap to flow, but we do at the moment get cold enough for birch sap, which is a bit of fun. So maybe you could turn that into some sort of alcohol. And then you've obviously got the opportunity for truffles as well. Now my system is a little bit different because not only did I decide to plant trees, and I've gone 36 meter alleys and 6 meter belts with double rows of trees in them. But I've got wild margins running up the side of each field that connect into a wild seam that I'm developing through the middle of my farm. This is all about that interconnected nature of my farm, making sure that wildlife can get kind of everywhere in the farm, and ensure that those beneficial insects and beneficial animals can be there, making sure that we've got as much nature on the farm as possible. And there are some lovely little kind of useful benefits as well. By creating these smaller fields, which I'm kind of terming microfields, it also means that we can, make changes on the fly pretty quickly, and we can trial new things, trial new establishment methods or termination methods for cover crops, for instance. And if it's a problem, you can chuck it back into, say, a herbal lay to fix whatever problem you've made there. If you want to see kind of my full ideas on my agroforestry scheme, I've actually got a full video on it on my YouTube, so head over there and have a look. This is actually the full list of trees. We've got some yet to be planted. But yeah, I didn't just go for apple. I kind of went pretty broad church in what I'm growing. So this next one here, this is actually an apricot tree. I'm really excited about the apricots because I'm obviously trying to plant the trees as a mitigatory, or to mitigate climate change to some extent. But also I thought, well, climate change is probably still going to happen, so I might as well have trees that work in warmer climes as well. So we've got apricot, peach and nectarine, and then I'm planning persimmon, pomegranate and olives as well. And also agroforestry is a great tool to enable some organic conversion to go on. I've talked about the massive benefit of having these lines of trees going up where you've got your beneficials can stay. We're completely reversing that desertification that was talked about by the entomologists. We've got the wind breaks, and then the roots are these really fantastic water management tools. When they get established, you've got to do some root pruning where you kind of use a subsoiler along the edge of them just to stop your roots going out in the field. So you stop that kind of moon effect around roots that you get on the headlands of fields quite often at the moment. But also a really beneficial thing with these, we're getting really hot days at the moment in sort of April, where we're going above 25, 26 degrees, at which temperature wheat will stop photosynthesizing. So by kind of planting these trees, you end up lowering that temperature in your microfields, and your plants will actually photosynthesize longer, which is obviously going to boost your yield. And there's also another little side point about resilience. I mean, I've been planning this agroforestry scheme for 5 years now, but one of the things I like to do on the farm is to kind of sit down and have a look what's going on the farm around me. And this harvest, obviously not particularly good yield. So I jumped off the tractor when I was on corn cart and sat down and had a look at this hedge. And this hedge was just busting with fruit, even though our arable yields were down sort of 20 or 30%. So we've got perennial hedge fruit up. And really agroforestry is a way of kind of harvesting that additional benefit. So, you know, if these hedge fruits are up, the agroforestry fruit would have been up in that year if those trees were established. This is the true definition of resilience. One lot of cash flow in your diversification is going to be down one year, but another lot of cash flow is going to be up, rather than just growing 3 combinable crops. So what else am I doing besides agroforestry? I mean, I like playing around with lots of things. So I mentioned earlier, we've put in lots and lots of herbal lays. I really like pretty flowers. So we've got some lucerne in the middle. I mean, it's amazing the improvement of soil health you get by planting these amazingly diverse lays. These were Cotswold seeds lays, so 20 odd species in there. And like the ecology boost on these lays is phenomenal. We've got loads of tiny finches and stuff that eat the chicory seeds at the moment. They seem to absolutely love that. Yarrow and crimson clover will still flower into January, February sort of time. I know that's a common butterfly to people who know butterflies, but it's pretty, so I took a picture of it. But also it allows you to diversify even more, because if you're going to add grass, you obviously need some lawnmowers, and these are some gorgeous red poles. Red poles because they're poled, which means I can do cow selfies like with 101 there on the right, but also because they're actually a dual purpose animal. Oh, hang on, I don't know what's going on there. They're a dual purpose animal, so they're for beef and also for milk. And that's one of the things I'm planning with these. But not everything goes swimmingly. So I bought 11 cows in. Oh, for some reason there we go. Bought 11 cows in. Unfortunately, 5 of those have something called neospora, which essentially means that there's a high likelihood of those cows aborting. So we had 2 abortions this year, and I've got 3 more cows that have got the disease. So I'm going to have to kind of cull them from my herd, unfortunately, but I'm looking to get more animals anyway. And we had 3 calves. So Iris came nice and early. We then had Asta and Engelbert. All of the bull calves are going to be called something Bert. And it's great because obviously you could grow crops to feed to cows and have them in a shed, but then your ground doesn't have a rest. You don't improve the fertility in that ground. You're kind of proliferating this, you know, chemical input nitrification style of farming. Or you can stick it into a herbal lay for a few years, have a secondary enterprise, which might be yours, might not be yours. This one I wanted to be mine, and let cows graze it. You're going to massively improve your fertility. You give that ground a proper rest. You're going to grow a stonking crop of wheat after it. And as well as that, it's interesting that you get a really new appreciation for your farm because you're walking over every inch of it. You're no longer sat on a boom sprayer or sat on a seed drill driving over it quickly. You see every inch of your farm when you go out and check your cows every day. But obviously, I'm sure a lot of you are aware that I play around with quite a lot of different crops. So buckwheat is a fun one. Agronomically speaking, it's quite useful because you can plant it late and it will still do pretty well. It suppresses weeds. Lentils I've been doing as well. So these crops I grow for Hodmedod on the Norfolk Suffolk border. Again, lentils are great because you plant them late and can harvest them at a normal time. But again, there are lots of harvesting problems with them. They sit really low, they get really weedy. I've also played around with hemp, which has 0 market at the moment. So that's something that needs developing. But the fiber options on hemp, I'm sure tons of you have grown hemp before actually, but in a system whereby people who were buying it had a very non-resilient business model themselves. I also grow a lot of heritage wheats. So this year has actually been a disaster. All of these have been put in the ground, and then they had sort of 270 mil of rain on them in 7 weeks after that, so they're not looking very happy. I'm hoping to at least be able to harvest my seed. But some of the fun stuff in these heritage wheats is just how beautiful they are. So this is einkorn on the left. It actually looks like blackgrass for an awful long time of its life, which is a little bit perplexing, and then suddenly goes nuts and romps away. And then we've got Purcell's blue cone, which is a rivet wheat, so a little bit like a durum wheat, sort of a pasta wheat. These older wheats are actually really interesting. So again, pre-modern wheat breeding, pre-1935. But they have very different gluten strands, so they're much less likely to attract any sort of gluten intolerance of people who are eating them. So yeah, lots of reasons to be investigating these different crops. But I'm just going to talk very briefly here about the marketing of small food, because a lot of what I've talked about here is really difficult to do. Not only when you're dealing with small quantities, it doesn't go out on a 29-ton bulker anymore, and you're suddenly dealing with the end user, which is both brilliant and nerve-wracking at the same time, because you don't want to mess up. You suddenly really care about the crops that are in your shed. And winters look really different, because now I'm kind of looking after the cows or building a mill room or all the other 101 projects that I seem to have taken on recently. So this is a mill. I bought this at the end of last year, and I'm just building the mill room, like I say, for that at the moment. And I've got quite a few bakers interested in the products that I'm going to be developing for them. And I've got lots of other future projects in the pipeline as well, because otherwise life would be very boring. So these future projects, a Carfoot Dairy. I actually went and visited Rebecca Mayhew at Old Hall Farm in Norfolk yesterday. Well worth a visit if you go up there. They do a Carfoot Dairy system, and they're making yogurt out of that, as well as selling obviously the raw milk. So that's something I'm looking to do with my red poles, and I may even cross something on top of those red poles as well. A non-farm bakery I'm working on that's hopefully going to be coming into action sort of next year sometime. And then I'm looking at building a large reservoir, which is going to enable market gardening back on the farm, and all the benefits of kind of the short supply chains and people actually really having a grasp of where their food is coming from. So the overarching aim of all of this is essentially to produce as diverse a range of nutritional products from my farm as I possibly can, but with nature at the very heart of that. And some of the fun of this is you can play around with products in different ways. So this was a YQ wheat risotto. Just do it like an ordinary risotto. It took sort of 2 or 3 times as long to cook down, but really delicious. And buckwheat galettes. Who needs to put wheat flour in your pancakes? You can do different things. And again, you grow these different crops and you can start doing some really fun things with them. Anyway, I'm going to stop for now. So I think it's question time. I hope it is. Anyway, I really hope you've enjoyed listening to me. And yeah, lovely. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, George. That was really inspiring, and I don't know where you get your energy from, but there's no doubt, I think, that we are all going to need to adapt and try new things. So hearing the great range of what you're doing is really fantastic. I'm also doing a Carfoot Dairy, so that's very exciting.
Oh, brilliant.
Rebecca, what have we got in the way of questions?
Well, actually, your question was the first one, Elizabeth.
All right.
On your organic land, George, are you trying to avoid ploughing, and if so, how are you managing the weeds?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. I will inevitably be doing a small amount of ploughing, but I'm looking essentially at a system whereby, I mean, this is why it's so important to have the Carfoot system, whereby the cows are really making kind of multiple incomes, because the plan is to have sort of a 4-year herbal lay, followed by 3 years of arable cropping. And I think in a system like that, you can easily get away with just 1 year out of 7 being ploughed. As well as that, I mean, around about 40% of my farm is going to be in permanent organic cover anyway. So you've got lots of habitat, and then the habitat is so close to any piece of ploughed ground that it's not going to be a problem for that to be reintroduced with nature to get back out there, for wildlife to repopulate that ground. So yeah, it is a small concession, but I think it's a concession that's worthwhile because of all the issues you get with the use of synthetic inputs on the land.
Yeah. Okay. Just staying with the organic theme, a message from Andrew. He says you're doing a great job without being organically certified. So what are the benefits, do you think, of being registered organic?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, especially considering it took me 4 months to complete my organic conversion paperwork. I really hate paperwork. I didn't realize there's going to be so much, to be honest. So long term, I don't expect to keep up with my organic certification. If I get to where I'm planning to get to, which is essentially that everything that I grow on the farm will be marketed through the farm gate. At that stage, I don't need organic certification. All I need is my word and people to see my Instagram and Twitter and understand the fact that I don't use any synthetic inputs on the farm. In the short term, I do still supply bakeries in London and other people like that, and they need organic certification on that product. So it's kind of, it wasn't really a choice in the short term. While I'm in this kind of interim period, it's necessary. So that's why I've gone down that route.
Okay, brilliant. So a message from Will, who's purchasing your YQ wheat, and is there a limited quantity requirement, or can they just not get enough of it?
Yeah, so it's a really difficult one on this because the market on this is growing. There is a reason I felt like I had to get my flour mill. So I've sold through to E5 Bakehouse before, and they actually have their own mill in their bakery in Hackney. But an awful lot of bakers don't. And actually, if bakers started getting their own mills, they'd discover the issues of having a mill in a bakery versus a mill on the farm, because suddenly you've got bran as your byproduct. Like, what on earth is that bakery stuck in the middle of London going to do with a mountain of bran that they suddenly end up having? You know, you can dip your loaves in it to some extent, but only to some extent. And it's the benefit of consequently having the mill on the farm, because that bran is then able to go through some kind of additional enterprise that I'm going to form in the future, or hopefully someone else will form on the farm for me. So chickens or pigs, probably for that. But yeah, the fact I've had to get the mill is to make sure that I'm able to supply a lot of bakeries that I want to supply. They want my product, but they need it milled for them to be able to take it. So that's kind of just a little bit of a hiccup at the moment. But I think that there is a big market movement for fresh stone milled flour. I would suggest people not to rush onto the bandwagon, but give it a couple of 3 more years, and I think there'll be a lot more demand. The only thing is, if you're going to grow crops like this, they cannot be grown with synthetic inputs.
Yeah, yeah. And what sort of yields do you get with your YQ wheat, and how does it compare? How do your margins compare to conventional?
Yeah, I mean, I took my margin calculation slides out because I thought they were just a bit boring. But it's a completely different view on what you're trying to do here. So I don't talk in gross margins or net margins because quite frankly they don't actually mean anything. And you know, I've written a whole spreadsheet that kind of actually tells me exactly basically it tells me what I need to be selling stuff for to be making what I deem a sensible profit. So I tend to sell my YQ for £550 a ton cleaned. So originally after Anglia Grain have come in, but I'm actually sorting out my cleaning setup at the moment. So it's worth a lot more money, but obviously requires an awful lot more work and is in much smaller quantities. And yield wise, I mean, it varies a bit. Last year, I think it did well last year. It got 4 tonne a hectare, I think, last year. But yes, a lot, you know, if you're going to grow without inputs, you're obviously going to get lower yields. But for a little bit of clarity, I mean, like I said, we're on a really worn out farm here at the moment anyway, which is why we've kind of gone big into the herbal lays and grazing them. And with it being so worn out, like we were only getting 7.5 tonne anyway. And I've never been a massive user of synthetic inputs. That's with 180 kilos of nitrogen max, sometimes not even that much. And you know, not going bananas on fungicide, so maybe only doing a 2 fungicide program. But the benefit of moving to these direct to market food products is you can actually market on the fact you've not used any synthetics on them, and it's great because you're not wearing your sprayer out, you're not wearing tractors out, everything's easier. It's like, you know, much as though we've been in a mindset of yield, producing as much as possible. There's as much of a problem producing too much as there is too little. You've got to store it, you've got to move it, you've got to, there are lots of problems with that. And actually one of the massive benefits I've found in moving to the system that I've moved to now, my cost of synthetics has gone from around about 160,000 to 35 to 40,000 a year. So my cash flow management now is like comparably is an absolute doddle. And it's so nice, just not, you know, rather than managing a cash flow that does that, managing one that just kind of evenly goes along like that, it's a completely different approach to how you're farming, which is, yeah, really a much more relaxed approach to farming, certainly.
There's just one question, just going back, because I missed the question about worms and increasing organic matter, the best cover crop for worms. I don't know if Emily, it's a difficult one to answer, because I think it's not so much about the cover crops, but it's also about the management of the soil that increases the worm activity. But Emily, have you found any cover crops that have fared better for worms and increased the worm count than any other cover crops particularly?
So in this year it was very varied, to be honest. I mean, I guess generally it seems that the simple mixtures tended to have the higher worm counts. That's the one with the more oil radish, the Phacelia and oat. I don't know whether it's producing a bit more leaf litter, which is giving some organic matter. It's really the only conclusion I can draw from results from this year at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, in comparison, the cover crops, obviously, to the stubble control, there was a lot less worms seen in, the stubble where there was no vegetation growth, really.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, one final question, George, and I'm going to ask you to keep it relatively short. Are there any specific reasons that you're anti-gene editing?
Join the talk on Sunday.
Yeah, well, can you just tell us where the talk is and how people can dip into that?
If you look on my Twitter, that's probably the easiest.
Okay, we can put
essentially, okay, so there's a really easy example that explains why I'm against it. I had a big argument on Twitter about this recently with some very knowledgeable farmers who had just slightly missed the point. So if you talk to people about BYDV, barley yellow dwarf virus, everyone says that the issue with barley yellow dwarf virus is aphids. So if you go and talk to a gene editor and say, right, we've got this problem with something with BYDV, we need to create a crop that is resistant to these aphids so we no longer get BYDV. Those farmers have entirely missed the point. BYDV is not an issue with aphids. Aphids are a vector that carry BYDV. They are not the cause of why you have got BYDV in your crop. You have BYDV in your crop due to over nitrification of your soils. Your plants are not healthy. They've got way too many sugars and they end up with really soft cell walls, which means the aphids are able to bite them, and they want to bite them because they like the sugars. So basically we've gone wrong. And if you talk to any organic farmers and ask them if they have problems with BYDV, they're like, no, of course not. Like, it's just not an issue for an organic farmer because their soils are in much, much better balance. But the problem is if you go down the gene editing route here, you still allow over nitrification of soils. You're not changing your farming system. You're not fixing anything. You've addressed the symptom, not the root cause. And that is my key reason why we don't go down the gene editing path. We don't need it. You can mitigate climate with tree planting in alleys like agroforestry. There are natural ways of doing these things. You don't have to go to a science person to do it. The problem is that the government love going to science people because it's a secondary economy and it makes us look really flash to other countries. But it doesn't mean that it's any good for biodiversity or anything like that.
Good answer, George. Thank you very much. We're running out of time, unfortunately. I think we could go on for another hour. I certainly could. But thank you very much to all the speakers. Yeah, a really interesting morning, I thought. And thanks to Affinity for funding the event, to Kings for providing the cover crop seed, and to George for a really thought-provoking talk. Perhaps, George, you would allow us, when we are able, to have a FWAG walk on your farm and actually look at it in real life, and see how everything's working. So last word is just to say, if you want to contact us at FWAG, stewardship is now open. The capital only grants finish on the 30th of April, and there have been changes to that this year. Higher tier need to get in by the end of May, and mid-tier by the 30th of July. So do get in touch if any of those are of interest. You can use Emily's email address there. to do that. Yeah, thank you very much, and have a successful spring on the farm. Thanks very much.